Welcome to the Reduce Cyber Risk Podcast, where we provide you the training and tools you need for your cybersecurity career. Hi, my name is Shon Gerber, and I'm your host for this action-packed, informative podcast. Join me each week as I provide you the information you need to grow your cybersecurity knowledge while taking practical and actionable steps to protect your business from the evil hacker horde. All right, let's get going. Welcome to the Reduce Cyber Risk Podcast, March 25th, 2019. Hey, all, this is Shon Gerber with Reduce Cyber Risk, and we've got some great things in the cybersecurity news space this week, along with some awesome training that we'll be providing you via Reduce Cyber Risk Podcast. And what the plan is for today is as we all know, cybersecurity risks are there every day, every day, all days, every week, all the time, every time. I can't even speak really well, but bottom line is cybersecurity news, there is tons of stuff that's going on. And what we tie into a lot of the cybersecurity stuff that you see in the news today. Much of it is you'll see of different hacks that occur and so forth. But if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, one of the things that I focus on from Reduce Cyber Risk point of view is around the cybersecurity professional and some aspects that you may want to be concerned of as you are looking for enhancing your career along with protecting your company. And if you are looking for a certification around the CISSP, this is a great place to augment that training that you might be looking for to get that certification. The cool part about Reduce Cyber Risk from a standpoint of podcast goes, you can get a CPE, 1 credit hour with SANS if you're working on your CISSPs just by listening to this podcast. So it's some good stuff that you can use, just especially as it comes to relating to getting your security professional certificates all taken care of and done. All right, well, let's move on. Some of the things that have been in the news, we got 3 main topics that we'll roll into, and then we will throw into some training. But the first topic is going to be around U.S. chemicals firms and a cyber attack that's hit them. The second one's going to be around the New Jersey bill, which is broadening the PII breach notification. And then finally, vulnerability assessments versus penetration testing. And we'll get into some of the nuances of that. Finally, the last piece of that is going to be the cybersecurity training is going to be around PCI-DSS, which is your payment card industry data security standards part 1. I have to break it into a couple parts because honestly, it's pretty exhaustive, and it's pretty much an overview. So this PCI-DSS is well searched. People are always looking for it, and we're going to kind of go over it today. So, U.S. chemical firms in a cyber attack. Now, this is reported by Security Week, and basically what it comes down to is there was 2 major U.S. companies that were recently hacked. Now, what had happened is they were affected by a product called Locker Goga. I gotta love these guys, man. They come up with some awesome names like Locker Goga. Why didn't they come up with like Bill or Fred? But no, Locker Goga. It's a ransomware that has hit these 2 U.S.-based companies, and they were chemical companies, Hexion and Momentive. And the issue around that is the malware that was used on these 2 systems was very similar to the attack that occurred against Norsk Hydro, which is a Norwegian aluminum company that was attacked last week with some ransomware. Now, as we all know, ransomware is running throughout everybody's networks, and there's points of that will affect almost every company. The biggest issue, though, is the fact that these are chemical companies, and so therefore it's imperative that you don't want things to kind of go south on those. So as ransomware rolled into this environment, and I'll get a little bit into the use case around what happened to Norsk, but these 2 major companies had just dealt with this, and it was very, very similar to what was seen at Norsk. They basically said it impacted the corporate functions, so it didn't actually get into the process network, which would be pretty bad. But it did impact the corporate aspects of it. And these are owned by the same investor group. So basically the group that owned Hexion owns Momentive. So one investor group owns them both. And they said that they had to order hundreds of new computers along with provisioning new email accounts. So that's kind of interesting aspect around this. One of the points that came into, and the FBI talks about this as well, is the fact of do not paying. We'll see what Hexion and Momentum have decided to do, but Norsk Hydro did not pay, and that was last week. One thing is very similar around this is that it attempted to use Active Directory credentials, and we'll kind of go into that a little bit around the use case that was with Norsk. So as I say that, let's roll into that. That use case with Norsk is basically what happened is they have about 35,000 employees globally, a very large aluminum company out of Norway. And what ended up happening I think it was on a Tuesday morning, they showed up and it's all locked up, not good. And because of that, their IT folks couldn't get in. They couldn't do anything with the systems at all. They actually had to degrade themselves to what they call a manual mode, which basically means pulls all of IT out of the mix. So all of their processing, everything they were doing from tracking orders, you name it, was all done via pen and paper. So that they had to kind of make some changes in that. Now, one of the points that they had mentioned, as one of the articles that I read about this, that they did a very good job with, was around the incident response aspects. In the fact that what they did was they were able to get up a website up and operational. They communicated with people. And it was interesting in the fact that typically when this is a publicly traded company, typically when a breach occurs, the stock or the share prices will drop. Actually, because of the way Norsk handled it, their share prices actually went up. So that is actually a very telling sign to give to anybody that's in the cybersecurity space, that how important that incident response process actually is. So one of the things they recommended was that they had done all that. They had actually provisioned new systems, new equipment. The other thing that was interesting about the Norsk attack that actually helped stave off some of the issues, I mean, they basically went into full meltdown mode, but there were some key aspects as it relates to communication that they were able to get around. And one of those was because they had just provisioned Office 365. So when the ransomware came in, and we all know ransomware goes in and encrypts your hard drive basically on a vulnerable system, or encrypts a vulnerable system in general, what happens is that you lose everything. If you have Outlook, if you have your Exchange, whatever it might be within your environment, if it gets encrypted, you're done. You're adios, muchacho. So, what ended up happening was because of Office 365, they were actually able to communicate and help through the incident response process. So, point taken, it's good to have Office 365 as you're relating to some of these issues because they're independent of what you might have on site. The other thing is interesting about all this is that it appears that a domain admin was compromised, and this domain admin account that was compromised, at least one, allowed them to replicate their Trojan, basically the Locker Goga. They were able to replicate it via Active Directory versus a standard worm that would proliferate through your environment. By using Active Directory, it's actually quite smart. You're not going to turn Active Directory off in most cases. So it allowed it to proliferate and look for vulnerable systems. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of it. And the fact that now these are chemical companies that have been attacked. I mean, bottom line is they're big enterprises. I don't know if it's focused specifically on chemical companies as a whole, but other than the fact that they are big enterprises and they're big business. One of the things that does run into these issues, and it's really important, is the fact that you segregate your networks. If you do have a process network, you work hard to segregate it. And an option out there is called the Purdue model. And I believe it's ISA 99. I might be wrong on that. But bottom line is you want to segregate your business and your process networks apart. You do not want them together, just for reasons like this, where a Locker Go-Go rolls into town, and if they're together under one big network, well, then things get really dicey really quick. If they're separated, well, then you may lose some of your business functionality, but you may not necessarily lose part of your process network. So, interesting part, U.S. chemical firms are attacked, and we'll see what comes of it. But bottom line, big takeaways, Office 365 and incident response. This one's interesting. This is around the New Jersey bill that has just recently been proposed in New Jersey from the state senators around broadening PII breach notification. Now, the reason I bring this up is because this New Jersey, as another state, is bringing up this breach notification clause, or basically laws that are coming out there that they're trying to put forward. And this falls in line of what's happened in Maine, California, Ohio, and so forth. As these states are waiting for the federal government to come up with a plan around breach notification, very similar to what would be around GDPR, which is your general data privacy regulation that is within the European Union. What it's doing is it's forcing the hand of the federal government to make a decision and do these things. So this New Jersey bill, and what it does, is it was reported by SC Magazine, it basically includes usernames, passwords, email addresses, and security questions. So if any of these things happen during a breach, you must be notified by the company. So if I'm a cybersecurity professional and I've got business in New Jersey and I've got individuals that could potentially have been breached, their data was breached, and they live in New Jersey, then these things would potentially affect me from a legality standpoint. So anytime their username or password is breached, email addresses, or security questions, then therefore I must give some level of acknowledgement to that. This sponsor is State Senator Troy Singleton. He's a Democrat out of Burlington, and this Bill S-52, is working in conjunction with another bill that's A-3541. A-3541. It's like football. Yeah, that's not really right. But anyway, so yeah, that could be that too. Anyway, moving on. So the 5-day alerting is what this A-3541 has got it set up where, like GDPR, where you have 72 hours to report an incident, they want to put in a 5-day alerting amount for any company that deals with a breach. So as you see, the importance of all of this is that it's going to continue to change. There's always going to be these situations until, in the United States, the federal government comes up with some level of privacy law that will affect all the states. So it'll happen at some point. It's just a matter of how this all plays out. The interesting part is that now if you're a multinational company, you're trying to deal with all these different state privacy regulations and PII breach notification regulations. Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. So anyway, this is the one reported in SC Magazine, the New Jersey bill broadening PII breach notification. All right, so in this next one, we're going to talk about vulnerability assessments versus penetration testing. Now, this comes from out of IBM Security Intelligence, and this is out of an article they had out there. And, like I said, in Reduce Cyber Risk, I don't always just get into the different hacks that are out there because bottom line, there's hacks everywhere. So the goal is to ones that I feel from a security point of view will help you as a security professional, along with areas to kind of help add a little clarity. And this is one of those to help add a little clarity. For all you that might be listening and watching through my podcast or from the video, also it helps add a little clarity in my own mind. As I'm putting these things together, I learn a ton as it relates to different aspects and how I could be better at what I do. And along with that, this is one thing that I just didn't even think of. But I understand vulnerability assessments. In my background, again, I was a hacker for a while working for the government, did vulnerability assessments, did penetration tests, did all of those things. But that has changed dramatically from when I was doing this as a red teamer. Well, in the past, the scans would be accomplished before a system is activated. So before the cloud, what you would have is you'd have a system and you'd want to do a vulnerability assessment and a scan on that system, make sure it's not vulnerable, and then you put her out into service, right? And you're ready to go. Well, now with the cloud being the future, it is incredible what is connected to what. I was watching through a video today on some cloud AWS aspects, and one thing I learned is I saw all the capability that just continues to grow within AWS as a whole, and it's just there's no way you can keep up with it. So the part that comes into all of this is vulnerability scans were great when it passed when you had to do scans, but now the penetration testings are going to be extremely valuable just because of the simple fact that now as you get into the cloud environment, you can't test everything, and so you also gives you ability to go and be a very laser-like focus on certain specific areas, and ideally you would do this on areas that are of highest risk. So, let me give you an example of what is a vulnerability assessment. It's a broad scan. It's a broad assessment of what's going on. Typically, it's a vulnerability scanning engine that's actually going out there and hitting your site, looking for potential out-of-date patches, vulnerabilities, whatever it might be. A penetration test is usually takes the information from a vulnerability assessment, then gets a laser-like focus on areas that it sees as a place that it could take advantage of, and then it just drills into that to see how far it can go. That is a penetration test. And so in the past, you've had very manual exercises when it dealt with scanning and also with penetration testing. Well, now this is all getting automated. And this comes down from the scans itself to the penetration test in some respects has been automated. Now, I say that, I don't know if I would trust the automation so much with the pen tests, because what I've learned is that things go sideways really quick in a pen test that you have very little control, especially if you put on an automated scan. So you may want to consider whether or not you want to do that or not. Now, as we're dealing with PCI-DSS, this is a part that I learned which is actually pretty cool because our lesson today is on PCI-DSS. But the vulnerability scans in the past would suffice. You'd have a qualified security vending company. They would go out and they would scan your website, and they still do, right? But that is what these people would do, and they would just scan looking for vulnerabilities, give you a report, and then you go fix them. Well, now PCI-DSS 3.2. You must implement the penetration testing methodology, and you must validate the segmentation that you've put in place for your network via pen tests. So you can't just go scan, because a scan will just do a periphery. You've got to use a pen test to dig deeper to go, oh yeah, he or she did separate their network versus now their network's all flat. So those are just aspects around the PCI DSS you're going to have to be aware of. And that's a really cool augment to the training we're going to have today. But bottom line is the new PCI DSS, you must need to implement some level of penetration testing methodology as you're going through this. And again, that's all dependent upon what is your SAQ, and that's your self-assessment questionnaire. How does that play? How do you play into that? But we'll get into that here in just a little bit. Another analogy is that they had talked about at IBM Security Intelligence was the vulnerability assessment is like your office doors are unlocked, letting somebody in. The pen test would be, what would the criminals do once they're in? How deep would they go? What would they look for? That's the pen test. So again, done them both. Vulnerability tests are great. They're very standard. They find the issues that are vulnerabilities that are out there. The pen test is when you can basically crack that bank open and get all the money out of it. But they are very, very labor intensive. There's a lot of work to them. But that's the vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. All right, so here's some of the references that we have: IBM, SC Magazine, and Security Week. You can check all those out at Reduce Cyber Risk, and you also can check them out here on YouTube. All right, let's roll into our training. All right, hi, this is Shon Gerber again with Reduce Cyber Risk, and we are on this part of the CISSP supplement. We're going to get into PCI-DSS. This is a topic that many people deal with on a yearly basis as they have to deal with their payment card industry requirements from the council that requires them to have some level of data security standards. So we're going to get into PCI-DSS. We're going to get into an overview of that, along with some things you can do as a cybersecurity professional on how to protect your environment with regards to the PCI-DSS requirements. So as we're dealing with PCI-DSS, there is a lot of things you need to consider. And PCI deals with the payment card industry. And the payment card industry came up with some standards that they had that they wanted people to follow. And as they did that, they said that there's important aspects that come along with it. And those important aspects are things that retailers or vendors, people utilizing their services, must put in place to protect their card data. If you don't do that, then what would end up happening is that you would lose the ability to have utilize cards for your environment. So if you're a retailer or some sort of vendor of some kind, and you have credit cards that you want to accept payment on or for, then what you have to have is you have to meet these standards. If you meet these standards, then the credit card companies allow you to continue utilizing their credit cards. If you do not meet these standards, then what would end up happening is they would revoke that capability from you. And so then if you can't utilize credit cards, and in today's world with all of the aspects around credit cards, that would be very hard for you to operate. So what they want is they want you to meet these standards. And so we're going to get into the basics of it. There's a lot that goes into this, and that standard disclaimer got to throw out there. If you have a requirement for PCI-DSS, there's a couple of websites out there, especially the PCI Security Standards website, will walk you through a lot of the different aspects of this. Reduce Cyber Risk will have things on our website around this over time, but this is an overview aspect of what you need to worry about as you're relating to PCI-DSS. So we'll first get into that. First steps, there's basically 3 steps for adhering to the PCI-DSS program. And first thing you need to do is you need to assess, and that's comes down to is you need to identify any cardholder data that you, 1, have to take in, and 2, you may have to maintain. So if you know that you're taking credit card information of individuals, you need to be aware of it, right? So you can't just go, I didn't know I collected it. Well, that's not going to work. So you have to be aware of what data that you are actually collecting on individuals. The second thing you need to be considering of, and these all fall in line with standard security practices. And if you are a business that's dealing with this, or you're a security professional, these are the basics that you really must do as you're relating to protecting your overall network, not just to even say the PCI environment. Is you need to identify of IT assets and business process payment card processing stuff. So basically anything that processes credit cards, you need to be aware of it. And what that basically means is that if you have a server that is collecting this credit card information, then you need to be understanding what does that mean? Where is that server located at? What does it touch? What switch does it connect to? Does it connect to the outside internet? Are there mobile devices that are connected to it? Is there other types of wireless connectivity connected to it? All of those aspects you need to be connected with and understanding as you're inventorying your IT assets, okay? So those are three. That's the first part of step one is assess. Then the last thing you need to do on assess is you need to analyze the vulnerabilities for data exposure. What does that mean? Well, basically, if you have data that you're shipping out due to your credit card transactions that you're taking, you need to understand the vulnerabilities with that. So as an example, you have a credit card machine that's an electronic credit card machine, and it dumps to a computer that's sitting in the back of the office. And this computer in the back of the office is running on Windows XP, okay, which is like way old, about ready to die. It was built back in the late 90s kind of thing, all right, 2000s, 2003, somewhere right around there. The bottom line is it's really, 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 really old. So if it's really old like that and you are putting credit card data on it, well, that would be a vulnerability, and that would be something that you would want to have fixed, in that you'd want to have a more updated system, most likely probably a Windows 10 Windows system that's operating with current patch levels. So the point of that is that you need to consider what are the different vulnerabilities if your data is out there and being exposed. The second thing you need to do is remediate. You need to fix vulnerabilities that are within your environment. So if you know that there's an issue, such as you have wireless connected to the same environment that you have your credit card payments being done, then you need to probably have that wireless turned off. You need to have it segregated from your own personal network, or from your business network. So those are things you need to fix immediately. Another one is don't store credit card data unless it's absolutely required. This is something that I can't strike home hard enough, is the moment you hold that data, you now are responsible for that data. You will be held liable for the protection of that data. So if there's opportunities where you can keep that data or not keep it and move it on to somebody else and pass that risk on to somebody else to take on, like a third party processor, then that's a better option for you. Now, in many cases, you can't do that. So if you can't, then you need to look at ways to protect yourself. But bottom line is, do not store any card data any longer than you absolutely have to. And if you don't have to store it, don't. Report, compile, and submit required remediation reports if required. Now, there are remediation reports that you have to submit to the credit card agencies that you utilize their cards, letting them know that what you're doing and how you're protecting their information. In some cases, now, not all cases are that way. If you don't, we'll get into these self-assessment questionnaires. They call them SAQs. In some cases, depending upon the vendor, say you collect credit cards on your website, but there's what we call an API. But bottom line is that when the credit card transaction gets put into your computer, it's never really touches your computer. It moves on to somebody else through this third party. And so because of that, then what would end up happening is you wouldn't necessarily have to file a report. Now, don't take that as gospel. Don't say that, well, because Shon said to reduce cyber risk, I don't have to do a report. Well, that would be a bad defense. Okay, don't do that. Second thing is you need to be aware of what you need to submit and what you don't. But that's an example of how you may not have to submit reports to the credit card companies because you're basically the pass-through in that. You're just bringing people to the website, but all the credit card information is staying more or less contained within a third party's application. And then you need to submit these compliance reports to the banks and card brands. So again, that's what you have to do depending upon your requirements. Now, there's some technical and operational requirements that you need to be considered as it relates to PCI security standards. Now, these were set by the PCI Security Standards Council, the PCI-SSC, And they were designed to protect the cardholder data. And basically, it comes down to a level of standards that needed to be in place. And it's also designed to manage the security standards and to give them, and as things change, how do they provide those standards to individuals? The enforcement is the founding members of this group. So there you've got your American Express, your Discover, Discover Financial, JCB International, MasterCard, Worldwide Visa, or Worldwide and Visa as well. And all of those are the main branches that have enforcement on the Security Standards Council. And they're the ones that are setting these security standards because they came to an agreement that this is what they need to do. And if they do that, then and they get the vendors to manage those security issues and hold on to those, then the odds are high that they will meet those, that the vendors will meet those standards from a consistent standpoint. Now, there's three different types of standards that are involved. There's a PCI Data Security Standard, which is the DSS, which typically you see PCI-DSS. There's the PIN transaction security requirements. Now, these are for, and we'll get into those briefly here in a little bit, but the PINs that you set up, your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those kind of PINs that are tied to your card. And then there's your Payment Application Data Security Standard, or PA-DSS. And that we'll get into that as far as how that deals with the actual application development and what you need to be concerned with when you're creating applications that specifically accept credit card data. Now, from a PCI Data Security Standard, who is this? Okay, so this basically it's a standard for all entities who process, store, or transmit card data. That's the PCI Data Security Standard was designed for, so the PCI-DSS. And the point of it was to build basically a common mirror set of best practices. Now, if you look at the best practices that are tied to PCI-DSS, they're very similar to what you'll get for any sort of cybersecurity standard for best practices anyway. They follow along those lines, and they're designed to educate people that may not be the most smart or the most educated on cybersecurity standards. I don't say it's smart in a demeaning way because I'm really quite foolish in most cases, and honestly, I've got a third grade education in pretty much everything. But bottom line is they were designing these to help people who don't deal with this stuff on a daily basis. A friend of mine has a daycare, and she asked me about these standards and what do they mean and how does she work them and what is a firewall. So those are all aspects that it can be very confusing to somebody, especially if they're just getting started. And so as an individual, especially as we get into this where you could as a security professional be an assessor or in a situation where just you're providing guidance and direction, it's really good to understand, one, the basic security tenets that we want to try to maintain, but also to be able to translate that into an understandable language that these people can understand. If you're a business owner that's looking to reduce your cyber risk and you've got this business, this is a great way to utilize what we get on Reduce Cyber Risk to help you with these controls, because a lot of things that we talk about on Reduce Cyber Risk will fit these controls as well. So what are the main controls you're dealing with? We need to build and maintain a secure network. Now, if you don't know what that is, you're like, I have no idea. Bottom line is your firewall. You need to have things segregated. And if at the bare minimum, if you didn't know what else to do, and again, this is get a security professional help because everybody's network is different and how you set it up is very different. But at a bare minimum, do not have anything that accepts credit card information on the same network that you have your business network. Just don't do it. If you can do that, that's a huge benefit to you. It'll save you a bunch of time, a headache, and it may be a little bit more expensive in the short term, but in the long term, by segregating those networks, it's just well worth it. But you build and maintain a secure network, firewalls, and all the things that go into building an infrastructure around your security. You protect the cardholder data. Again, how do you protect that information that's coming into you? What are you doing with it? Are you encrypting it while it's sitting in your system, which you have to do? All of those aspects you need to be concerned about. You maintain a vulnerability program. You basically have the ability to you find patch holes in your environment. Do you fix them? That's just kind of where it comes down to. You implement strong access control measures. You don't let the guy that you just hired that does the ice cream at your restaurant have access to the credit card system. Now, he may process credit cards, but you don't let him have access to the main system. And if you did let him have access to the main system, then he has rights that are respective based on his role. So they call it role-based access controls, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But he has very specific very specific abilities based on his role. The other thing is regularly monitor and test the networks. So you may have the ability that you have to, depending upon what where you fall, you may have to have penetration tests done. You may have to have vulnerability scans done on your environment. But you need to test your networks to make sure that they are patched, updated, and protected. Then you also need to maintain an information security policy. Do you have this documented anywhere? Okay, so it's great to say that you do it, but do you really do you document it that you actually do what you say you're going to do? And then those are important pieces, because a lot of people think, it's just paper. Well, it is, but it also shows that you've taken time to understand what are the risks, how are you going to mitigate those risks, what are you going to do to fix them, and how would you do that? Would you implement a third party to come help you fix them? Do you say you're going to do it all yourself? They just want to know that you've thought this through and that you're following what you say you're going to do. Now, when you're assessing the compliance, they set a set of standards. PCI Security Council did. And each company has an own program for enforcement and compliance. So what that basically means is American Express has their own thing that you have to do for enforcement and compliance, which means you may have their own report that they want you to file. So-and-so Visa may have another report they want you to file. But bottom line is each of them will have something they want you to follow. The standards are basically to get you in the right ballpark. The DSS security standards are. But then when it comes to filing reports and so forth, each of the credit card companies will have their own set. Now, there's plenty of third-party software out there that will help you with all of this. And there's plenty of people that will help you get your system up and running around it. But the bottom line is you have to know the basics, especially as you're communicating with them on setting up an environment. What does that mean? How is that set up? Another thing I've run into is like with churches. So in my church, they have the ability to collect credit card information. Well, in the past, it was very old and antiquated. Now they actually have it's all online. They have companies that will do that for them. And so they take the PCI standards that they would have to do in the past. Some of that has been transferred to this company because it's all online. I say that though, if they are accepting credit cards in any other format other than through a specific API on a website, now they still have to follow those PCI standards. So it's really kind of tricky because you got to be careful. It isn't just, okay, I'm done, I don't have to worry about it. No, you still have to educate yourself on these standards as well. So that's that aspect. Now, security assessment questionnaires. Now, these are tools that are designed to basically report on compliance, and they created these to help people understand what do they need to do next. How do you deal with this, right? And they're based on their business environment. So depending upon what your business environment is, will depend upon what you have to do, like anything else. So you got to, depending upon your security, your business, and we've kind of alluded to this a little bit, do you have to go through a bunch of processes to make sure that you meet the PCI standards? So a couple of the examples that are out there for businesses, that some different types of security assessment questionnaires, is you have your SAQA, your EP, which is your Echo Papa, Bravo, Bravo dash India Papa, Charlie dash Victor Tango, Charlie, Papa 2, Papa E, D, merchants, D merchants, D service providers, and so forth. Okay, so all of that there, if you're listening to this on a podcast, you're probably going, what the heck did I just say? It's just an alphabet soup of what you need to worry about when it comes to these self-assessment questionnaires. If you're seeing this on video, you'll see this and go, that makes absolutely no sense. But bottom line is each of those has their own requirement on what you cannot do. And a couple examples that I have out there. So one of them is card is not present merchants. Okay, so basically what it comes down to is you're a merchant, you do not keep the card, they don't have the card, they can do it all online, right? And so the card's not present in your hands, you don't see it. And so it's all of that functionality is outsourced to a third party. So you don't keep any of the cardholder data, you don't have to worry about anything like that. What ends up happening then is you follow the SAQA, right? Now, if you're dealing with a partially outsourced e-commerce merchant where maybe you have some of that stuff is kept on your servers that you may have, it's not, there is some transactional aspects that are happening with your website. Like I'll use an example of, I've got like on Reduce Cyber Risk, we have a membership site that's going to be setting up. And so what would end up happening is because of that, we will be accepting credit card information. Well, I accept credit card information, but it's done through it's partially outsourced through the e-commerce aspect of this. So it falls under the SAQB is where I would put that at. It's utilizing a third-party website for payment processing, such as PayPal, Stripe, so on and so forth. It does have, SAQB does have requirements around what I have to do to protect my website, but since it's all outsourced with other parties, even then it's pretty simple. Now, if you hosted your own website and you had your own CMS that's sitting in your own environment, then that's a different animal. You have to maintain how do you protect that website from outside hackers and so forth. So again, there's different aspects that you have to do. SAQA is, again, card not present merchants, and then SAQB is partially outsourced e-commerce merchants. But if you go through the alphabet soup of A, EB, and EP, I think is the shorter version of that as well, B, and so on and so forth. There are different ways things that are out there that you can do to manage this stuff. So again, they'll walk you through the different self-assessment questionnaires of what's important to you and your environment. Now, you have a qualified assessor and approved scanning vendor. Now, these are programs that assist in facilitating compliance with PCI-DSS. Depending upon which one of those buckets you fall into, you may have to have a qualified assessor come validate that you actually are doing what you say you're going to do. Now, in most cases that I'm aware of, and again, I'm not a PCI-DSS guru by any stretch, and there's people out there that will help you with that if that's what you need. Those are in the higher level aspects of the PCI environment. So if you're in the service providers and so forth, in most of those cases, they have quarterly requirements to get assessed by an individual or a company that will then qualify them to make sure that they are protecting the credit card data the way they're supposed to. So those are qualified assessors, and they are approved by the council to assess the compliance of what an individual is doing. So those qualified assessors will come out usually once a quarter, and they will look at your environment. And it could be as simple as that you have to file a report with them and communicate with them, or it could be that they have boots on the ground. It just kind of depends upon the situation and what you are actually as a provider. There's also an approved scanning vendor. If you have a website that is required that collects payment card information, and due to your SAQ, you have to get your site scanned on a routine basis for vulnerabilities. These qualified scanning vendors will do that, and what they do is they work as a third party, and they use tools such as like NetSparker, or there's other tools out there that will do this. But they will scan your websites for vulnerabilities, and then they'll provide a report to you to get these vulnerabilities fixed. So that's the purpose of these scanning vendors. This comes down to the site or based on your self-assessment questionnaire on whether you need one of these or not. My recommendation, though, is if you are collecting any sort of credit card information, whether you are a e-commerce vendor like myself that was pushing it through a third party, you still should have your site scanned. And this can be done in multiple ways. You don't have to pay for someone to do that. If you're a small operator, depending on your risk, you can do that yourself. But bottom line is that should be done as well, just to ensure that you don't have vulnerabilities that are open within your environment. PIN transaction security requirements, the PCI-DSS. So now the key aspects of this applies to companies that make devices that accept personal identification numbers, PINs, right? So you put in, you've got the chip on your card, and realistically all that chip is really designed to do is to provide a second factor of authentication. It doesn't really do anything other than that. They have some future enhancements built into it that they want to utilize with it, but when you put that in and then you tie that with your PIN, it says, that this PIN is associated with that number or with that card. It's also is the fact that if you have so you have that with a debit card. Now, if you have a credit card and you use your credit card and there's no PIN to it, all that's saying is that that chip is confirming that this is a physical card. Yes, it's a legitimate card, and it communicates via that way. So it's just another factor of authentication is what it utilizes. And now in Europe, they utilize that chip in a much broader detail than they do in the United States, because the United States was a little bit slow on that end. But again, there's more functionality that's built into it you'll see in the future. They recognize lapsed to validate the adherence to PTS requirements. And so what happens is they realized that there were gaps in when people were creating these products, so they came up with a standard or requirements for anybody who is adding pins to these credit cards. And what they need to do is they also have this set up. This standard is for financial institutions, merchants, to also ensure that they have the appropriate PTS devices. So when you go to your store and you enter in your PIN, you put in your card and you enter your PIN in, and they want to ensure that it meets these requirements to do that. The one thing I've always struggled with looking at those card readers, and the other thing that's kind of interesting, is they look like you got them out of a Cracker Jack box. They're plastic little things, and I'm like, they don't look real. And I assume that there's a reason for that. One, probably to keep costs down, but two, they just look kind of clunky. And it's kind of interesting. But I know they do this to keep it very lightweight. They don't want to put a lot of money into it, and plus the more code that you add into these things, so from a development standpoint, the more overhead and the more features you add to these devices, the more areas for vulnerabilities to be incorporated into the environment. So I'm sure plays into this quite a bit. They still look like they are quite like you could buy them at a toy store. The PTS requirements cover physical and logical security. So what these come into is you now have a credit card, right? So you have a physical security of that device. They also cover the logical security. When that data is connected and taken from that card and it's transmitted to the credit card company, is it encrypted during transmission? Is there any resident credit card data that's stored in memory? How is that managed? If it is it segregated from the rest of the network? How do they manage that data from the moment that it goes in to the moment that it gets sent to the company? Because hackers are smart. I mean, they're going to do it. They're going to go follow the money, and what they're going to then end up doing is they're going to see if there's places they can exploit it. And if there's credit card numbers that are sitting resident on a computer system that they can manipulate, they'll do that. So it's kind of security standards that are, it's not kind of, it is security standards that are set up specifically to help break up the physical and logical security of these devices. Now, payment application data security standards. What is that? Now, a new standard was recently published back in January of 2019, and it's basically around the security software the software that you're creating for these devices and for collecting credit card information. Now, it's based on the PCI software security framework, which consists of two aspects: the PCI Secure Software Standard and the PCI Secure Lifecycle, SLC. So those two pieces fall under the software security framework, and this was helped to come in January of 2019. Now, when I did the recent podcast, we talked a little bit about that the change had happened. The good thing about this is that because more and more people are utilizing credit card data online, they had to make some changes to their security standards. So as an example, I know right now in China, they use WeChat a lot, and they use credit card data on the WeChat. Now, they don't do the typical United States where they're scanning credit cards all the time. They just have all that stuff integrated within the applications. The United States is a little bit slower in that regard. I don't know if it's good or bad or different, but adoption of Apple Pay and those kind of pay methods are a little bit slower in the United States, but they are taking off in the Western or in the Asian countries. Now, it also helps software vendors secure payment applications. So basically is that it helps them to go segregate the data and ensure that they don't store prohibited data, which would be in many cases it's I think it's a UPN or PAN. It's the PAN. It's basically the number of the actual credit card number itself. And so it helps them to not store this data. It does not include applications developed internally. So what that basically means is it forces them that if you have a vendor that's creating it, that the standards apply. But if you build this homegrown solution, these do not apply to that. Now, the bad side of that is that if you are building these internally, you need to follow some level of standards as well as you create this stuff, but they have no way of forcing you on anything as far as you develop internally within your own company to accept credit card numbers. However, I will say one thing to be concerned with is if you do that, you now open yourself up to some significant risk in my mind. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you that from a security point of view, that would open you up to some risk that you're developing this stuff internally. Just because unless it's in your comparative advantage to do so on a routine basis, to build this kind of software, the odds are high you will incorporate vulnerabilities and risk into that code. So I highly recommend, knock on wood, that you purchase a third-party software, that this is what they do from a development standpoint, especially if you're dealing with some sort of credit card information, just to reduce your risk. You don't want to take on that liability. They ensure that also that the council is using approved payment applications. The purpose of that is, are you using approved payment points? Are you using Stripe? Are you using PayPal? Are you using some other product that's collecting payment card data in a way that follows their standards? Or are you using Billy Bob's payment card company that he just stood up last night out of the bowels of the bayou in Louisiana? And if that's the case, well, then you probably are setting yourself up for a little bit of failure there. So the point of it is they wanted to set these standards in place, that you're ensuring these developers are actually following a set of standards to create applications that will meet what they are looking for to protect their card data. All right, that's all I have for the part 1 of the PCI-DSS security controls here on Reduce Cyber Risk. Check us out at reducecyberrisk.com. We've got some great stuff there. We'll be rolling in next week to PCI-DSS number 2, which will be the follow-on on some of the security controls you can put in place to protect your company from a business standpoint, and as a security professional, what you need to know to help protect your company. All right, have a great day. Talk to you later.